Good morning, everyone. My name is Melanie Chasteen, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We are extremely excited to be hosting this session, and based on the number of folks registered from throughout Texas and the United States, it's definitely a topic of great interest. Speaking of locations, here's a quick poll for you to do so we can get an idea of where everyone is. Before we get into the content of this webinar, I want to share a few tips for you using the platform and a bit of background information about the Texas campaign. First, we have muted all participants to help reduce background noise, but we welcome your participation and questions using the Q&A function you see at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for one of our presenters, please submit it using that tool. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. Also, we will email a PDF version of the slides to all participants following the webinar. We are also recording and will post the recording on our website at txcampaign.org. Finally, the Texas campaign relies on data to inform our work and future programming. We ask that you help us continually improve the trainings and resources we provide by sharing your feedback through a brief survey that will be emailed to you upon the conclusion of the webinar. For those of you who are seeking social work or licensed professional counseling CE credits, this evaluation is required. I want to extend a warm welcome once again to our partners and colleagues across the state. For those who may be engaging with us for the first time, the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy is a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing teen pregnancy through research and data dissemination, advocacy for effective public policies, strategic collaborations, and training and events. We have the privilege of working with healthcare providers, educators, social workers, researchers, coalitions, community organizations, elected officials, philanthropists, and others. As a small organization with a statewide reach, we started leveraging the power of webinar technology just this year to grow our engagement efforts. This is the second of several webinars we will host this year on a range of topics, and we would love to know about any areas of interest to you. There will be an area in the evaluation form where you can send those our way. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our upcoming statewide symposium, as it's an excellent opportunity to learn and network with others in the field. In its 8th year, it's scheduled for April 15th through 16th in Austin. We have a great lineup of speakers, including Dr. Rayne, a co-presenter on this webinar, who is also our opening keynote. Both 1- and 2-day options are still available at txsymposium.org. We hope to see you there. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our two speakers, Dr. Nick Winges-Yanez and Dr. Rayne.
Hello, this is Dr. Nick Winges-Yanez. I am a licensed master social work. All of my background has been in social work. I am also a sibling of someone with an intellectual disability label. And who had sexual offending behaviors. It was because of this experience that I decided to go back to school and kind of figure out what the research was. And what I saw was that most of the research said we should provide accurate sex ed and recognize the sexuality of those who are labeled with IDD. I also found many dismal stats related to trauma and sexual abuse. Additionally, these same myths associated with those labeled kept reoccurring despite studies stating that these were in fact myths. And there were quite a bit of lack of resources available for people to provide accurate and comprehensive sex education. So this is kind of how I came to be in this field in particular.
Hi, I am Dr. Rayne, and my background is pretty purely as an educator. My bachelor's degree is in secondary education, and my master's and PhDs are in educational psychology. I have focused the majority of my career on sexuality education broadly, really looking to bring sex education to everybody, because we all are in such need of expanding our understanding of both the anatomy and physiology, biological aspects of sex and sexuality, but also the more nuanced parts around sociology and human connection, communication, things like that. So I've been working in the field for about 15 years, and I'm the executive director of Unhushed. We write and distribute and train on comprehensive sexuality education. Nick and I first met. She reached out to us actually because she was excited about our CSE work. And I was super excited to meet with her because I've had a vision for bringing CSE materials to people who are labeled with IDD, and so have been looking for ways that we can do that more effectively, both within Unhushed, but then also more broadly as a culture, which has led us here.
Yay! So I'm going to briefly go over a little bit of history of how we got here. And first, I'm going to actually go over language. Usually whenever I'm talking to professionals in any field, they're hesitant to even broach this topic because they're afraid of entering this minefield of language, specifically with people with disabilities. So first, I'm just going to throw out there what people first language is. If you know what it is, that's great. For those of you who don't, the Association for Persons with Severe Handicaps, which is only referred to as TASH now, TASH, in the late 80s, pushed for person first language as a way to highlight the person instead of their disability. Person first language posits that disability is only one aspect of a person. By using person first language, the entire person is acknowledged versus just their disability. This has helped change the understanding of disability. Additionally, other changes in language were put forth, such as not using, ever, never using, wheelchair bound, or even the term spastic. A cultural shift was happening around other identities around this time, and the same work was being done within the disability community. However, the changes in understanding were not as widespread. So, for example of person first language, a person with an intellectual disability versus an intellectually disabled person. Another example of using person first language would not be using the phrase mental age. So often within the field and outside of the field, we often talk about people who have intellectual disability labels as having this mental age of 5 or 6 or whatever they conceive their comprehension level to be. However, we would rather say higher or lower support needs. When we're talking about someone and using mental age, it becomes subjective because I often counter with this person who is 30 years of age and is being called someone with a 5-year-old mental age. I say, well, that person's been living as a 5-year-old then in your head for at least 25 years. So I'm pretty sure that they have managed to figure some things out that a 5-year-old has not figured out. So mental age is not considered appropriate.
Can I add on to that, Nick, which is that this also, I think, doesn't really acknowledge the realities of hormones that are existing in somebody who is 30 years old in their brain, which is a little different than your mental age. But I think nevertheless, it speaks to, particularly relating to sex and sexuality, our need to acknowledge the biology of living in a 30-year-old's body.
Exactly. And what all research has shown is that regardless of whatever somebody's disability label is, that the body is going to mature at the same rate as anyone else, and hormones are going to happen, and puberty is going to happen, and these feelings are going to happen. So whatever we want to consider that someone's mental age is, their body is just going right ahead. And also, we have no true way of measuring intelligence, and I just want to put that out there. That intelligence is still being considered this, very comprehensive, complex thing that we don't actually know how to measure. Okay. Next is identity first language. So what is it? Why is it important or useful? Within the disability population, many self-advocates do not see their disability as outside of themselves or as negative. They consider their disability as inherently part of them. So identity first language is often used within the autistic community, where those on the autism spectrum identify as autistic. So an example of this would be an autistic person versus a person with autism. It's important to remember that the person gets to choose how they identify. And this is just a personal example. My sister has the label of intellectual disability and chooses to identify as special. And special needs is often considered outdated language. And though I have a hard time with this language, it's not my choice. So those without disabilities don't have the place to police the language of those with disabilities. And additionally, no one has the right to police how someone identifies. So the reason I wanted to start out with this discussion of language is that this is really the first minefield many professionals fear to navigate. But just as a rule of thumb, in case I confused you more, most professionals default with person-first language unless directed otherwise by the person. And a quick note about neurotypical versus neurodiverse, which is kind of been in the literature lately, more prevalent in mainstream. Neurotypical often is referring to someone who is not on the autism spectrum or does not have a cognitive difference, whereas neurodiverse is referring to someone who is on the spectrum or has a cognitive difference, and it's really to take away the stigma associated with these other labels. So it's really kind of taking the label back.
And can I ask a question about that, Nick?
Sure.
I've been hearing the word allistic a lot recently. Allistic as a way to talk about somebody who is not autistic. So I've been hearing more about autistic versus allistic. Have you heard of this language?
I have not. I often just heard neurodiverse, neurotypical. I have not heard allistic.
It's really just been in the last month maybe that I've started seeing it. And so I wonder to what degree it has permeated conversations.
Well, I think that really speaks to the fact that language is constantly changing, and keeping up with it can be difficult, which is why a lot of people fear kind of entering into this conversation, which is why I say really just kind of adhere to the rule of person first and then refer to the language of however that person defines themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Which might be allistic. Okay. So intellectual disability myths, what are they? There are 4 main ideas associated with sexuality and intellectual disability. And what's interesting is that these myths have permeated the literature for decades, and they continue to be discussed today as reasons why we don't provide sexuality education, which is just mind-boggling. So the first one is that people with intellectual disability are incapable of understanding the nuances of sexuality. The second one is that people with intellectual disability labels are really considered perpetual children. The third one is that they are only a victim or a perpetrator of sexual abuse. And finally, this final myth is really associated by the fact that it's this glaring silence within the literature, and that is that people with intellectual disabilities can only identify as heterosexual or cisgender, and that is by the absolute absence of a discussion within the literature is how this is a myth, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So myth 1, intellectual disability equals incapable of understanding the nuances of sexuality. And this is where I'm going to throw some history at you guys, because I think it's really important to understand where some of these ideas came from and how incorrect they are. So Edward Seguin was referred to as the first specialist in intellectual disability, which was at the time considered called feeble-mindedness. He believed that people who were feeble-minded were just stuck in development. They were in arrested development. And in order for people to move forward, they needed to become unstuck from this arrested development. And then the only way to do that was to use a pedagogical approach wherein psychologists and psychiatrists were the absolute masters of the people. So they were in charge of telling the person what to do and when to do it at all points of their day. Three basic points of Seguin's work were that people labeled with ID were not mad or crazy, they just had unbalanced instincts. They were stuck in arrested development, and psychiatrists needed to be the absolute masters. And so this really led to institutions being architecturally developed to look more like boarding schools, so that people would go there and live there and also attend classes all day in order to unstick them from their arrested development. And whether these institutions looked like hospitals, where some of them did, or they looked like schools, what was framed as necessary was the institutions themselves, because people who had ID labels were often thought of as being passionate, gluttonous, filthy, self-abusive, and intemperate. So depending on the audience being targeted, because institutions had to ask for funding from the government, the institutions either highlighted the fact that individuals labeled with ID were innocent and needed to be protected, or they were semi-bestial and other people needed to be protected. And for the audience being told that people were semi-bestial, an image emerged that emphasized criminality and danger, that focused on sexual danger, and specifically rape, masturbation, and prostitution. And this leads into the second myth, and that is that intellectual disability means victim or perpetrator. And really, it was only these two choices that came up whenever we talked about sexuality and ID during this time. So the framing had said that institutions were really available and necessary in order to provide training for people, and it was a safe place for people who were labeled. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, that framing really just started to turn. And because of published cases from American and French psychiatrists connecting feeble-mindedness to sexuality in particular, the framing changed to one of protection, which was protection of society from feeble-minded people. And really quick, we see this being put forth through a study that was put out by Herbert Goddard, who was a psychologist, who was a very famous psychologist. And he said that he took all these different cases and put them together and created this one idea that was really going to tell everybody what sexuality and IDD was all about. And it was the Kallikak family. And the Kallikak family tells the story of a degenerate family who was illiterate, poor, and purportedly immoral. The twist of this story is that the man of this family was a soldier, and he had a quote-unquote dalliance with an allegedly feeble-minded barmaid before he righted his moral ship and married an upstanding moral woman. And what the story showed was that this dalliance with the barmaid, who was labeled as having an intellectual disability, led to an entire family and generations of criminals, people with substance abuse disorders and mental health diagnoses, who were basically not appropriate socially. And whereas his other family was full of soldiers and upstanding citizens. So this is the idea that people who had an intellectual disability were either really promiscuous, or they were much more vulnerable to sexual advances from other people. And in particular, women of childbearing age were extremely considered dangerous at this time. And that was because they could reproduce and have these generations of children. So this is where we saw eugenics kind of really start to take hold. And eugenics is where sterilization without consent of people with disabilities within institutions was starting to happen. There were laws put into place to have eugenics or sterilization happen, and those laws kept being pushed down because the judges said they were inhumane. However, the case of Carrie Buck versus Bell in 1927, you can look it up, was really the court case that said, you know what, this is something that's needed, it's important within society, and it was what started a full-fledged eugenics movement within the US. And one of the quotes from the Supreme Court Justice who heard this case when we were talking about sterilization within the institutions, he voted to have people with intellectual disabilities sterilized without consent. And his reason was, we have seen more than once public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains vaccinations broad enough to cutting the fallopian tubes. So that was the Supreme Court opinion on the case that led to the decision to allow eugenics within US institutions. And in fact,
it seems like this could only have really negative effects on their sexuality education.
I know. Yeah. And the thing is that people who were being let out of the institutions because they had reached some imaginary point of being able to now be in society had to be sterilized before they were let out as part of their release conditions. So, myth 3. Intellectual disability equals innocent, pure, and should be viewed as children. So those are people who should just be viewed as children. And this came about in the 1950s, really based on work by Pearl S. Buck, who you might know as the author of the classic Good Earth. I never read it. She wrote this book called The Child Who Never Grew and referred to her own child who had an intellectual disability as a forever child. And other people who were considered celebrities at the time, Roy Rogers and his wife, Dale Rogers, publicly acknowledged that they had children with intellectual disabilities. So they kind of brought it out of the closet, which was great, right? They were saying, yes, I do have a kid with a disability. However, they also started to say, you know what the great thing about this is that these children are gifts from God who are pure and innocent. And that led to an entirely different narrative, meaning that children should not at all be associated with sexuality because they were considered pure. And religious overtones led to discussions of procreation, or more specifically, how to protect against pregnancy and reproduction of people with disabilities. And that continues until today as well. And finally, intellectual disability is heterosexual. If they do have any sort of sexuality, it's often identified as only being heterosexual or cisgender. And again, this is from reading through the literature and reading through the history. And whenever anyone is identified as having a sexuality, or we're going to talk about sex ed or relationships, it's in reference to cisgendered men and cisgendered women. And so that's something to really think about when we're talking about sex ed, right? Because if we do talk about someone, there is a curriculum out there that was saying if there's someone who has an intellectual disability and they identify as a gender other than what they were born with, then the correct action is to refer to the mental health counselor and their parents, because this is obviously a manifestation of their disability. And that seems to also follow suit for any orientation that is not heterosexual. So then we move forward. We had deinstitutionalization happening. We had civil rights happening. Disability rights were starting to happen. And doctors started to say, you know what, we should probably think about the quote unquote sex question, because people are going to be living within the communities now. And this is probably something that we should now address for real. So birth control was considered important for girls labeled with ID, but there really wasn't anything addressed for boys labeled with ID. At least half of the parents in a study during this time of children labeled with ID considered sterilization. And again, there was this idea that if someone was sterilized, they wouldn't be interested in sex. And so, Karen, in a little bit, you might want to address that a little bit more.
Fertility doesn't equal sex drive?
Yes. This is like something that continues even today. I could tell you so many examples. Okay, but so within this study, at least one family reported that they let their daughter get fat and unattractive so they would not have to worry about men taking advantage of her. And again, this is in the 70s. This continues today. I've heard these quotes today. In the 80s, we started to see some curriculum start to be introduced specifically for people with intellectual disabilities regarding sex education. Circles was one of the bigger ones, more famous ones by Leslie Walker Hirsch. And that is available today as an app. So it started in the mid-'80s. And there were studies saying, you know what, we are sexual from birth to death. And given appropriate permission, information, and opportunity, we'll discover ways of expressing that sexuality. It was like mind-blowing in the 1980s. And adults with IDD living in the independent living arrangements or within community homes do in fact experience their sexuality with themselves and with others. So doctors and pediatricians were saying, you know what, this is a reality. This is something that happens. What are we going to do about it? So in the 90s, the American Pediatric Association said people with IDD need sex education. Studies indicated a need for sex education for people with IDD, which will empower them to make informed decisions about their sexual preferences, how to take action to prevent negative outcomes, how to avoid sexual exploitation, and it should probably include discussions of feelings and negative attitudes from society about their sexuality, which was kind of groundbreaking and I think extremely relevant today even. So in a statement by the APA in '96, pediatricians were told to assist with sex ed because parents of kids with IDD, one, denied their kids' sexuality, two, they feared sexual exploitation, they feared pregnancy, and they really had a difficulty deciding what to talk about and how much to talk about. So the APA said, you know what, pediatricians should be helping parents with this discussion. So in the early 2000s, this is a picture of a book by Michael Gill that he put out called Already Doing It, which he looked at different curricula and also the history of sex ed associated with IDD and came to the conclusion whether or not someone has sex ed, they're going to probably engage in some sort of sexual activity. Again, Karen, I'm sure you're going to find this mind-blowing. So,
Wait a minute, Nick.
So again, the APA in 2006 repeated what they said 10 years prior and said all people, including those with IDD, are sexual and should assist parents with sexuality education for the same reasons that they had listed before. So this was just repeating the same information from 1996 in 2006. So that is some of the research that we have up to this point, some of the basic history of it. The most recent research that's going on right now is looking at autism and gender variance and orientation. So there was a report that came out that said adults on the spectrum are more likely than neurotypical adults to identify as something other than strictly heterosexual or strictly cisgender. And I thought that that was really interesting. It's not saying that they're definitely going to identify that way or they're more likely. They're just more likely than neurotypical. And I think strictly is an important word here. They're not really into identifying within strict labels. And that's a recent article, which is also in the end of this PowerPoint. We have some resources. So, challenges. What are they? You know, I think that this is going to be kind of the meat of our discussion today of like, what are some of the challenges and what are some tips that we can take moving forward. I think what's interesting is that we are still having the same discussion that we had 40 years ago about sex ed and IDD. We've kind of plateaued and we haven't necessarily moved forward much. So most educators have not been trained on how to teach sex ed, and this leads to unintentional misinformation and value transference. So if someone did not receive great sex education and they're asked to teach a program that they're not trained how to teach, then it's really easy to kind of just rely on their own education and their own values to teach this education, which is, I think all of anyone who's in sex education knows that that can be dangerous. And school districts, whether or not they support this implementation of sex ed, lack of available curricula, and knowing that adaptations of current curricula may actually censor or limit information when it comes to special education or students with IDD labels. And often educators may not see the usefulness of providing sex education. So, Karen, do you have any thoughts on any of those challenges?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that they're all very real. You know, people come to me with some frequency asking for solutions to those challenges, which is part of why I was so excited to meet you. You know, there's one of the things that we posit at Unhushed is that sexuality education is a basic human right. And this is an area that I find is useful in making some headway, particularly among administrators and parents, and talking about the need for sexuality education. You know, it's so common for people labeled with IDD to have their basic human rights removed from them. And that's a point of conversation that I feel like is more visible and common and accepted as true in the communities out there, as true of, you know, children and adults with IDD. So we're starting to speak a language that feels more accessible to both schools and other settings, and then also in the home environment, by saying, you know, this is a human right, and your child or your family member or the people who you work for and with, they deserve this as an element of their basic humanity.
Yes.
You know, but then the next step, which is like actually doing the sexuality education, is still, you know, in some ways a question mark for a lot of people. You know, as you said, we haven't really moved forward. And kind of that first step needs to be training programs. So we need existing materials, and then we need to train people on them. And that step is expensive and time consuming in a field with already pretty low resources.
You know, so I talk to a lot of people who are like, well, I just don't know how to move forward. Or why would I need to be trained on sex ed when I obviously know how to have sex, or I know about like the birds and the bees. So why do I need to be trained on this when I'm teaching other people? There's obviously an inherent, you know, right and wrong, and I can tell that to somebody. So like, why would you say it's important for someone to be trained on this?
Well, people get trained in how to teach everything else, right? We don't expect people to dive into teaching math or English or, you know, life skills or really anything without some training and support on, hopefully, both the theory behind teaching those content areas, but then also the specifics of the curriculum they're working in. And so in the same way, we need to support people in talking about sex and sexuality. And this is a very common thing. I've had even, you know, middle schoolers be like, I don't need your sex ed class. I know all about it.
I have the internet.
Yeah, exactly. You know, but there are things that are important and relevant. We need people to have an understanding of, you know, what trauma-informed care means in a sexuality setting specifically, for example. And we need people to have a comfort with the language and a knowledge of what the language is. You know, it's not common knowledge what exactly the reproductive system does. And, you know, even if somebody has sex and has had kids, that doesn't mean that they understand the biology mechanics behind it. And even if somebody has had really great, healthy relationships, that doesn't mean that they understand the nuances of supporting other people in achieving that same goal. So your own experiences are not something that qualifies you to then dive into a classroom and just start doing the things. You know, you need some additional support in how to actually teach the topics.
Yes. Thank you, Karen. So when we're talking about ideas moving forward, and Karen, I'm going to rely on you to do this a little bit more. So availability of curricula and importance of sex ed. So there are not, let me highlight that again. There are not a lot of comprehensive options available for students with IDD labels. Many educators might have to adapt an existing curricula because the ones that are available are censored or limited from the ones that I've looked at. And there are a lot out there, but not a lot of good ones. And it's important for all the same reasons as anyone to receive sex ed. But when we're talking about people with IDD labels, for those of us who heard Josh Shapiro's story last year, talking about IDD and sexuality and how people are at risk, at a 7 times risk of being sexually assaulted at some point more than someone without a disability, I think that's really important. But I also think it's really important that people with an IDD label are not allowed to express themselves sexually or experience the wondrousness of sexuality, however that looks for somebody. And it's going to look different for everybody, just as it does with anybody without a label, right? So a lot of learning happens within social circles, whether it's right or wrong, like whether the information is correct or incorrect. A lot of that learning happens within social circles. And people with IDD labels have a much, much smaller social circle. So they're not learning a lot of these things that are going on. Also, there's the limits of language. So if people are not given the language, and this is in the research of different orientations, so LGBTQ or different gender identities, they don't have that language to express themselves, and that really limits them and their sexuality. If you're talking to someone and they're trying to express themselves and they've never been, discussed with other orientations or gender, or even talking about the nuances of a healthy relationship, then how are you supposed to expect them to then engage in those healthy relationships, right? Do you have anything else to add to that, Karen? I could go on about the importance of sex ed and why it's so awesome and amazing and important, and especially when we're talking about people with IDD labels. They have a lower body autonomy because they're often treated as kids, and they're often going to the doctor for other reasons. They have lower body autonomy, so they're used to people touching them, and they need to be able to have the skills to say, this is my body and I can say no to you touching me. And they're often not even given that language or that discussion or foundation of their own body.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Nick. And I did some work last year with parents of kids with IDD. So, really probably 21 and younger. And this idea of teaching consent was actually pretty scary to them because they were worried that their kids would then not consent to medical treatment. Mm-hmm. And they were also, in the same breath, talking about the importance of consent when it comes to sexual interactions and not quite being able to bridge the gap of, well, this idea of consent is so critically important in multitudes of ways. And I can't say that they can only consent about sex, but not consent about medical treatment. It was a place that they felt very torn and very ambivalent, which is, of course, part of the reason why people who are labeled with IDD have such an increased risk of being sexually assaulted. Has, very much to do with this lack of bodily autonomy.
Yes, absolutely.
And then just briefly about the availability of curriculum, I'm not aware of any comprehensive curriculum that has a really thorough modification guide or is designed specifically for people with IDD. And so I think that there's a lot to be said there for learning how to make your own modifications, mm-hmm. which is right now, I think, what I can recommend as a best practices approach.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with you. And that, again, leads back to the importance of training on this material so that you can make those adaptations and continue using the curriculum in an adaptive way that makes sense for your students. When we're talking about teaching methods, so it's really important, obviously, to use concrete examples and concrete language when we're teaching students with IDD labels. Abstract ideas are not going to work. It's really important to be using plain language. And plain language means that we're working at, I think it was just reduced to a 6th grade level, making sure that we're using language that everybody understands. We're not using jargon, we're not using acronyms. And if someone doesn't understand something, that we start to explain those things if there's no other word for it, that we're repeating the complex information and using a lot of examples. This has been super important when I've been teaching sex ed, and that we have to do an extra amount of examples to kind of understand the information that's being put out. And part of that is because it's helpful for learners. Also, part of that is because a lot of these students don't have a foundation in sex ed. So we kind of have to start from a different point of view and say, okay, we're going to practice this a lot and repeat this a lot because there's no background for this information that you have. And really practicing skills like assertive communication and body autonomy and practicing that language. So if somebody says gay, they know what that means. It's not, a slur. Or if someone says queer, that it's not a slur of what that actually means. And that's been really helpful in trying to convey this information for students. And I can't stress enough the assertive communication skills. Allowing people with IDD labels who have historically not been given choices, have historically had stuff done to them, have had labels put onto them, have been told what they can or cannot do. Allowing them to practice this assertive communication is so vital for having a healthy relationship and a healthy relationship with their own body. And in every lesson, we practice that assertive communication somehow, and we practice consent somehow, because it's a completely new concept for a lot of people. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, can we give some specific examples of the things on the slide, Nick?
Yeah.
I know I have one actually that's from a colleague though, so this is not my story.
Okay.
But my colleague was working with a couple who were both labeled with IDD and was talking about the importance of condoms, and they were really on board. And so my colleague came and showed them how to put on a condom using a banana, which was great. And then, came back a few days later and they were like, we want you to know we used the condom just like you showed us. Come and see. And my colleague was like, I don't know what I'm going to come and see, but okay. And came back to the bedroom where there was a banana with a condom on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the specifics here are so important, and moving past kind of, I think that a lot of us have a hesitancy to use really specific language like your penis.
Mm-hmm.
And, even though that's definitely what we're trying to get across using this euphemism of banana.
Right.
But what we really need are these higher level specifics.
Right. When our class practiced putting condoms onto a zucchini, I would ask, so what is this zucchini supposed to be? And students were like, either they said, I don't know, or they were like, the penis. And I was like, yes. So where does the condom go? It goes on the erect penis. And there was a lot of going back and forth on that information before everyone got it, because why are we putting a condom on a zucchini, right?
Right.
Like, why? So we had to go back and forth quite a few times to get that information there and make sense, which is great. Like, I'm all for doing that. And going back and forth with plain language. So going over the body parts is another thing that I'm really want people to get used to. So a lot of students who I'm working with right now are over 18 and they don't know the language for the vulva or any of the reproductive system at all. They just know penis and that's it. And so we go over that over and over, and there's lots of giggling and there's lots of laughing, but then there's also this ownership of like, well, I know what that is now, right? And using that plain language of just like, this is what, we have all these slang words that we use for this, but what does it actually mean? And kind of getting to the bottom of what it means. And it's really helpful. Or if we're saying, you know what, we're going to be talking about oral sex, like that doesn't always translate. What is oral sex? So we have to break it down. That means putting your mouth on whatever. And we go into that a little bit more. And people are like, oh, okay, so that is oral sex. That is using plain language. That is saying, you know what, we're not saying oral, we're saying mouth, right? So using those plain language and concrete examples to really discuss this idea with people. And when we're talking about boundaries. So boundaries is kind of an abstract concept if we think about it. Boundaries can mean, you know, I don't want you to call me 5 times a day. That's my boundary. Or my boundary could be, this is my personal space. So every day we kind of go over that. Like, what is your boundary today? Is it, you know what, I don't want to sit next to you? Or is it, you know, I just want to be kind of quiet over here. What does your boundary mean? And kind of getting them used to understanding some of these more abstract concepts.
Yeah, thank you for doing that with me. I think that those are useful.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's also more fun because you, because it's way more fun to say mouth on, you know, penis versus oral sex.
I mean, really, I think that all of these are good recommendations just across the board. Like, I'm going to be really honest, is that these are in some ways just best practices approaches for teaching sexuality education broadly.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many young people I have who are not labeled with IDD who ask me what oral sex is or what a blowjob is. You know, they're like blowing at me like, what is a blowjob? And, you know, we need to be able to use concrete language with everybody. Just the demonstrated need here is perhaps more obvious.
And I think it also just kind of demystifies it and allows for more conversation to happen and a little bit more openness to happen so that people don't feel like it's this intimidating thing to talk about, right? Like, they don't have to be scared of talking about it. So really quick resources. There are not a lot of resources. Unhushed, absolutely. And I can give a little push here because I am using Karen's middle school curriculum right now in a post-secondary certificate program. And I'm having to do some plain language and adaptations with it because there's no background, no sex ed previous to this time. And it's just been amazing. There's a website called Respectability, and it's .org, and there's a lot of different things on that website, but there's specifically a sex ed resource page, and a lot of those resources are amazing. They're verified. They go through ASD and IDD, specifically. Maybe, I think there might be some mobility impairments are in there as well. And then Our Whole Lives, and that is a sex ed curriculum, and they have an adaptation specifically for students who have IDD. So those are the different ones that we have. Did you want to add anything to that, Karen?
I don't think so. My understanding is that Our Whole Lives resource was that it was just for people diagnosed with autism.
No, it's for, I think it's labeled as special education.
Okay, that's great.
It's an adaptation manual. It doesn't have a full curriculum that's adapted. It has a manual that tells you how to adapt it. Yeah. Oops. So these are the references you can look at. I have so many more if you would like to see those. I'm sure many people are like, no, that's okay. That is just depressing. So I would actually really like to open it up to questions if we have any questions for these last 12 minutes.
Yeah, I see we have one question here. It is, I'm an RN for people who live in group homes. They are not co-ed, and several of our clients have approached with myself and their caseworkers about having someone over so they can have sex. We are unsure how to address this with clients and the group home staff.
So I feel like there's a lot of questions in that one question, right? So is there the question of providing sex ed, but there's also the additional question of how are we broaching this with the group home staff and the group home administrators? And that's really a whole other subject because oftentimes people who are staffing these houses are having to follow specific rules and guidelines, and the administration has put out guidelines that are somewhat vague, but also saying, you know what, no sex is allowed because that just opens us up for liability. And so there's this difference in opinion of how to move forward. So I'm not sure if that's talking about how to provide sex ed or how do I talk to the administration and staff about providing opportunity for privacy. And there's this, assumption that if these are single gender homes, that there's not sex happening already.
Right, which I think is the really ironic part of this question. So there are people who are asking, but I'm pretty certain that there are people who are not asking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really sure exactly how to answer that. So we have the resources for different sex ed curricula. Again, if we're talking about group homes, I think another issue that comes up is, does that person have access to privacy, and access to like a safe place to have private interactions, which is often not the case. And kind of looking at, well, how do you think that sexuality is being expressed currently?
All right. Let's see. I see that there's a few questions that are popping up in the chat box, and then there's a few more in the Q&A box. So let's just go through the Q&A box here. How do you suggest using peer educators in delivering these curricula? We currently use a team teaching approach with an advocate educator and a self-advocate educator.
I think that can be a great approach if the peer educator is well trained in the curriculum. As I said, most people nobody really receives great sex education. So providing that education with the peer mentor, that they feel comfortable enough providing the education and that they've had that education as well. So I know, Karen, you had some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I think it's when we're looking at peer education, one of the downfalls is that the people who are often being trained as the peer educator or the self-advocate get way more support than their peers, who they are then going to train. And it's often a very effective program for the self-advocates and less so for the people who they are then working with. And so I think that we just need to be really clear on what the goals are of the programming and how much support are we really getting out into the larger community. Because the goal is then for everybody to get this really lovely, deep level of education and support.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's continue on here. Are there any studies to support the use of the unhushed curriculum, effectiveness studies? I'll answer that one. No, is the short answer. And the reason why is because we are not an evidence-based program. We are evidence-informed, and that's by design. We modify our curriculum annually. And so with that speed of updating, which is what's necessary to keep up to date with cultural shifts and movements, we're not able to do research. There's lots of qualitative feedback and research and very enthusiastic people, but we do not have research. If there's somebody who'd be interested in trying to create some kind of a research protocol on an ever-changing curriculum, I'm definitely open to that conversation.
I would just like to say that I'm very pro evidence-informed versus evidence-based, because evidence-based often becomes outdated. And in evidence-based work, we're looking at generalizability, and generalizability is really difficult when we're talking specifically about students with IDD labels. I would say any specific group. So evidence-informed, I'm a big proponent of.
Yeah, so thank you, Amber. We're aware of the OAH funding issue, and so different programs are available out there in different ways. There's some possibility with OAH funding to provide additional curriculum in addition to your evidence-based programming. And so that is definitely where some people are using the unhushed curriculum, is to quote unquote augment this other program, whereas perhaps in the end they're doing a little bit more unhushed programming than they are of the evidence-based one, but it's a way to get around the funding requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. How do I teach my child how and who to say no to if it's someone tries touching him? Anyone can say, I'm a doctor, it's okay.
Well, right, but I would assume that the person would know their doctor. And kind of talking about how well do you know that person. So if you're talking about a doctor, I'm assuming you're in a doctor's office and you're having that discussion. So talking about context as well. So if that person says they're a doctor, are they someone that you know? Are they, at the doctor's office? And if you're at school, is it the nurse? And if you still feel not okay about it, then I think you should be advising students that it's okay for them not to touch you unless you have a different adult there with you. I mean, I think that's okay to say. Karen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I like that where you're going with this is that it's really about context, and there's not usually going to be clear and simple one-line answers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the points, going back to what you said earlier about the need to repeat and keep talking about these topics, is that, the first time you say them, they're probably not going to take, because they are nuanced, they are contextual. And so, this is a learning point that will be a lifelong learning point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that will evolve over time and deepen with nuance and clarity. And as, parents or advocates or educators or facilitators, whatever label you want to put on us, we need to maintain that adherence to understanding that this is nuanced. It's not easy.
And I think it's important. I mean, if we're talking about facilitators and staff and teachers providing this information, to have a partnership with the caregiver or the parents to provide additional examples and even social stories. So people who work with students who are on the autism spectrum are probably more familiar with social stories, and those are extremely helpful in providing examples of this type of question. So like, what if a doctor says this? What if a teacher says this? Providing those choices for kids to learn, okay, well, I did this in my social story, and so I have these choices to choose from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that's great. There was one question that has now gone up in my Q&A list. I'm not able to pull it back yet, but it was something about working with people with physical disabilities as well as IDD. So for example, people who are in a wheelchair, who may not have nerves in their lower extremities, and how to provide that kind of support. Do you have any of that on hand, Nick? I'm not sure how much of that kind of work you do.
I don't have that specific on hand. There are resources out there for physical disability. And I think it's really important, really quick, to say, people with physical disabilities are still not getting sex ed, either because people assume that they don't need it because of nerve damage or whatnot. And so we need to be providing sex ed regardless of what we think is okay, because people with physical disabilities can also have extreme nerve feelings in other parts of their body, and still have sexuality and sexual expression and experience even orgasms from different parts of their body. And so it's really important to have these discussions. And I have a great example, but we're out of time, so I can't tell you.
Yeah, and we actually have a lot more questions that we just don't have time to get to. But one of them specifically is asking for those additional resources. So Nick, what do you think about pulling together your additional resource list and having that get emailed out to all of our attendees today?
Yeah, that would be great. Yes.
And then I know that I'm available for additional people to reach out to me if they have follow-up questions or would like to continue the dialogue in any way about Unhushed or our resources. Nick, are you open to being contacted as well?
I am, yes, please do.
I think we're both pretty readily findable via Google. And I'm at unhushed.org.
Well, thank you both, Karen and Nick, for leading us through this session. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for being with us this morning, and stay tuned for information on future webinars. We will share the slides with you guys later today. And as I mentioned before, a recording will go up on our website at txcampaign.org. Again, please complete the brief evaluation that we will email you shortly. And also, if you are seeking continuing education credits, that evaluation is required. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.